And so we begin with a story that at first glance sounds almost impossible, a president turning against his supreme leader and seeking to stop what is described as a looming massacre of nearly 2 million protesters in Iran. What does that really mean? How did this situation develop? And what are the forces at work that have pushed Iran, a country haunted by decades of internal divisions and external pressure, toward an unprecedented moment of crisis? In late December 2025, Iran was already struggling with a catastrophic economic crisis. The Iranian rial plunged in value, inflation soared, and ordinary people found food and basic goods increasingly unaffordable. The streets of Tehran's historic Grand Bazaar, the heart of Iranian commerce, became the epicenter of initial protests after shopkeepers shut their doors in frustration at the economic collapse. What began as economic discontent spread rapidly from bazaar alleys to university campuses, main squares, and smaller towns across every region of the country. By early January 2026, these protests had become nationwide and deeply political, calling not just for immediate fixes but for structural change in Iran's political system. Mint plus one. Unlike many earlier protests, these demonstrations were not confined to isolated groups but included ordinary workers, students, merchants, and families of all ages. Videos shared on social media before widespread internet blackouts showed streets filled with crowds chanting slogans like "Death to the Dictator," explicitly targeting Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the clerical establishment that has ruled Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The protests reflected both anger over economic desperation and profound political disillusionment with the country's leadership. Wikipedia. As the movement grew, Iranian authorities responded with increasing force. Security forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Basij militias, used live ammunition, tear gas, and arrests to disperse crowds. Hospitals in major cities such as Tehran and Shiraz were reported to be overwhelmed by injured demonstrators, many suffering gunshot wounds. Rights groups and activist networks reported hundreds of deaths in the demonstrations, with some sources estimating that fatalities could extend far beyond official figures, as the internet blackout and communication restrictions made verification difficult. Wikipedia plus one. It was within this volatile environment that the narrative of a presidential break with the supreme leader began to circulate. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who historically has been seen as more moderate than previous hard-line leaders, faced a brutal dilemma. On one hand, state ideology dictates loyalty to the supreme leader, whose authority in Iran's political system is unparalleled. On the other hand, the president could not ignore the scale of public grief, loss, and anger taking hold on the streets. According to some reports, Pezeshkian made statements urging security forces to distinguish between peaceful protesters and violent rioters, and cautioned against harsh crackdowns that would further inflame the population. The picture that emerges from credible reporting is not one of an outright rebellion by the president against the supreme leader, but rather an internal struggle over how to respond to a historic uprising. That struggle is visible in conflicting statements from different parts of the government. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has repeatedly refused to yield to pressure, framing the protests as instigated by foreign powers and insisting that rioters must be put in their place. He has authorized a hardline approach that includes robust security force deployment and a crackdown on dissent. Wikipedia plus one. In contrast, the president's public messaging has sometimes emphasized the need for dialogue and understanding, acknowledging that economic grievances are genuine and that drama escalates when people feel unheard. His calls to differentiate between peaceful protesters and violent elements have been interpreted by some observers as an attempt to limit unchecked violence and avoid what some critics describe as a government-induced massacre of the Iranian people. However, it is critical to note that there is no verified evidence that Iran's leadership, including the president, has sanctioned or carried out a deliberate plan to kill 1.85 million people, a figure that far outstrips any credible death toll reported by international monitoring groups or human rights organizations. AP News. By mid-January 2026, rights groups such as human rights activists in Iran, reported that at least 500 protesters had been killed and more than 10,000 detained amid the unrest, with some estimates, particularly from expatriate networks and activists, suggesting the true number could be significantly higher. Iranian authorities themselves have not released comprehensive casualty figures, and independent verification remains difficult due to the internet blackout imposed in an attempt to restrict information flow. Reuters plus one. Internationally, the situation caught global attention. Various governments condemned what they saw as excessive force against demonstrators, and some raised the possibility of consequences ranging from sanctions to diplomatic pressures. The U.S., under President Donald Trump, publicly supported calls for restraint and warned Tehran against further violent suppression, even suggesting that very strong options, including military responses, were under consideration if the situation escalated further. Iran, for its part, responded with rhetoric framing foreign criticism as interference in its internal affairs, and warned of repercussions for any military action against it. AP News. Amid this turbulent backdrop, the narrative of massacre spreads partly because of the chaos, the internet blackout, and the fragmented flow of information. As foreign media and rights groups compile figures and testimony from inside Iran, even as state media portrays a very different version of events, disagreements over casualty numbers, and the broader character of the crisis are almost inevitable. Some activists abroad have claimed much higher death tolls, and these claims often circulate widely online. But responsible reporting requires distinguishing between verified data and unconfirmed estimates. Wikipedia plus one another layer of complexity is the historical memory of prior protests in Iran. Iranians have faced waves of demonstrations before, most notably the Masa Amini protests in 2022 that resulted in significant casualties and global attention to Iran's human rights record. Those experiences have shaped both the protest movement's dynamics and the government's approach to dissent. It is within this long shadow of past unrest that the 2025-26 protests must be understood, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader pattern of societal frustration with political and economic stagnation. Wikipedia within the protest movement itself, some segments began to articulate more ambitious political goals beyond immediate economic redress, calls for political reform, even discussions of systemic change in the structure of the Islamic Republic, echoed across demonstrations. Prominent opposition figures abroad, including exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, a symbolic heir of Iran's pre-1979 monarchy, urged sustained resistance and offered visions of a democratic future for Iran. On the streets, such sentiment appeared in slogans and chants that directly challenged clerical authority. Middle East Forum, the government's response to these political elements of the protests has been unyielding. Officials, including judiciary chiefs, issued warnings of harsh punishment and even invoked severe penalties for what they labeled as crimes against the state. The supreme leader has insisted on portraying protesters as criminals manipulated by foreign adversaries, seeking to rally domestic support behind the regime. New York Post: this evolving struggle highlights the delicate and dangerous balance between authority and public will. If the president seeks to avoid indiscriminate bloodshed and advocate for a more measured approach, he is operating within a system where the ultimate authority rests with the supreme leader, who holds disproportionate constitutional power over the military, judiciary, and security apparatus. This imbalance means that even moderate voices within the government may find themselves constrained when confronting the regime's hardline elements. Wikipedia: the Iranian people themselves are the most crucial actors in this story. Their daily sacrifices in the face of tear gas, live ammunition, arrests, and state intimidation illustrate the depth of their desperation for change. Whether those protests will lead to political transformation, a negotiated settlement, or further repression remains uncertain. What is clear is that millions are engaged in a struggle that transcends simple economic grievances and touches the core of Iran's identity and future direction. Mint: as external powers watch and weigh options from diplomatic pressure to potential military actions, any intervention carries profound risks. A foreign military strike, even if intended to protect civilians, could further destabilize the region and deepen internal divisions within Iran. This is why the international community grapples with how to respond, balancing respect for sovereignty with concerns about human rights abuses. Spectrum Local News: in the end, the idea that the president has turned against the supreme leader and prevented a planned massacre of nearly 2 million protesters is not backed by verified evidence. What is happening instead is a complex power struggle within a theocratic republic facing one of the most widespread and intense protests in its modern history. That struggle involves internal disagreements over how far to go in cracking down or negotiating, calls from protesters for systemic change, and increasing global scrutiny of Iran's human rights record. Wikipedia plus one: the true toll of this conflict in lives, rights, and political stability may not be fully known for years to come. But the courage of ordinary Iranians demanding dignity and the tension between competing visions of Iran's future make this one of the defining political crises of our time. And as millions continue to march, chant, and resist, the world watches a nation at a crossroads between repression and renewal. Mint.